Chapter 33. Does rabies itch? His eyes were closed. His head was bleeding. Flora knew from Terrible Things Can Happen to You that head wounds bleed excessively, whether they are bad or not. All head wounds bleed excessively, she said to her father. Don't panic. Okay, said her father. Use this. He handed her his tie. Flora knelt down. She had a very powerful sense of déjà vu. Was it just yesterday that she had bent over the body of an unknown squirrel in Tootie's backyard? Ulysses, she said. She dabbed at the blood with the tie. The squirrel didn't open his eyes. An eerie quiet descended. The whole of the giant donut became preternaturally calm. Everything, the donuts, the squirrel, her father, seemed to hold its breath. Flora knew what was happening. She had read about it in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. It was the calm before the storm. The air becomes still. The birds stop singing. The world waits. And then the storm comes. Inside the giant donut, there was a moment of deep quiet, of collectively held breath. And then someone said, I think it was a rat. But it was flying, said another voice. It was in my hair, said Rita. The cook shouted, I'm going to call the cops. That's what I'm going to do. Rita was right behind him. Forget about the cops, Ernie. Call the ambulance. I have rabies. It was in my hair. You, said Ernie. He pointed at Flora with his knife. You tripped me. That's her, said Rita. She's the one. Plus, she brought that thing in here in the first place, dressed it up like a baby doll. I did not, said Flora, dress him up like a baby doll. And this is all your fault. The criminal element said that sometimes it was wise to put criminals on the defensive by making slanderous or blatantly untrue comments. The surprising unfairness of this tactic will often stop criminals in their tracks. It seemed to work. Rita blinked. She opened her mouth and closed it again. My fault, she said. Flora bent over Ulysses and put a finger on his chest. She felt his heart beating in a slow, thoughtful way. Gratitude and relief washed through her, and her own heart, which had been beating much too quickly, slowed inside her chest. It answered the squirrel's heart with its own measured thud, thud, thud. Ulysses, her heart seemed to say. Ulysses. I'm calling the cops, said Ernie. George Buckman, how do you do? Shouted Flora's father. Is there any reason to call the police? Well, for one, said Rita, it was in my hair. Do you think that the police should be notified of a squirrel in your hair? Said Flora's father. The idiocy of this question, its unsettling logic, made Flora suddenly grateful for her father. She picked up Ulysses and cradled him in her left arm. I think I can feel the rabies coming on, said Rita. My stomach itches. Does rabies itch? Said Flora's father. I'm going to call somebody, said Ernie. She tripped me. Whom do you think it would be wise to call in this matter of the tripping? Said Flora's father. He opened the door. He gestured for Flora to walk through it. She did. The door swung shut behind them. Run, said her father, and they both began to run. At some point, Flora's father started to laugh again. It wasn't a ha-ha-ha kind of laugh. It was a hooey kind of laugh. Hysteria, thought Flora. She knew what to do for her hysteria. Her father needed to be slapped. Unfortunately, there wasn't time right now. They had to make their getaway. Her father laughed all the way to the car. He laughed when they were in the car. He laughed as he placed his hands at 10 o'clock and 2. He laughed as he backed out of the parking lot and drove away from the giant donut. He stopped laughing only once, long enough for him to shout, Holy Bagamba, in the voice of Dolores the parakeet. And then he went back to laughing. Chapter 34. The Getaway. They were making their getaway, but they were making their getaway slowly, because even when Flora's father was thinking that things were hilarious, Even when he was talking like a parakeet, he still, apparently, did not believe in speeding. Flora kept looking behind them to see if they were being followed by the cops, or Rita and Ernie. When she finally looked down at Ulysses, his eyes were still closed, and a terrible thought occurred to her. "What if he has a concussion?" she said to her father. Her father, of course, laughed. Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you said about concussions. There was something about making the person with the head injury speak a favorite nursery rhyme so that speech patterns, slurring, etc., could be evaluated. Flora stared at the squirrel. He couldn't speak. Also, she doubted he knew any nursery rhymes. There was a small cut on his head, but the bleeding had stopped, and he was breathing softly, regularly. "Ulysses," she said. And then she remembered in its entirety an ominous sentence from Terrible Things. "It is absolutely imperative that you keep the potentially concussed patient awake at all times." She shook the squirrel gently. His eyes stayed closed. She shook him harder, and he opened his eyes and then closed them again. Flora's heart thudded once and then dropped all the way down to her toes. She was suddenly terrified. "Do superheroes die?" she said out loud. Her father stopped laughing. "Listen," he said, "we won't let him die." Flora's heart thudded again, a different kind of thud. It wasn't fear this time, it was hope. "Does that mean that you won't try to hit him over the head with a shovel?" she said. "I won't," said her father. "Ever?" "Ever." "You promise?" "I promise." Her father looked at her in the rearview mirror. Flora looked back. "Let's go to your place then," she said. "He'll be safe there." At these words, George Buckman started laughing hysterically. Again. Chapter 35. Fear Smells. Flora's father never walked through the hallways of the Blixen Arms. He ran. And Flora Buckman, holding her possibly concussed squirrel, ran with him. Flora and George Buckman ran because the Blixen Arms was owned and managed by a man named Mr. Klaus, who was in possession of an enormous or angry orange cat, also named Mr. Klaus. The cat, Mr. Klaus, prowled the hallways of the Blixen Arms, peeing on the residents' doors and vomiting in the stairwells. Mr. Klaus was also notorious for hiding in the green gloom of the hallways and waiting until some unlucky person stepped out of the door of his or her apartment or into the main entrance of the Blixen Arms or down into the basement laundry room, and then pouncing on the person's ankles, biting and scratching and growling, and sometimes, weirdly enough, purring. Flora's father's ankles were deeply scarred. "The cat can smell your fear," Flora shouted as she ran. "It's a scientific fact." She had read about fear and Terrible Things Can Happen to You. "Fear smells," said Terrible Things, "and the smell of fear further incites the predator." Ahead of her, her father laughed his hearty and seemingly endless laugh. If Flora had more time, she would have said, "For the love of Pete, what's so funny?" But she didn't have time. There was a squirrel to save.